DevOps salaries keep showing up at the top of the market. $170,000, $180,000, sometimes even $200,000. And it creates a very specific perception that DevOps is one of the fastest paths to high income in tech. But that perception is incomplete. Because DevOps is not just a role, it's a position inside the system. And position is what actually determines how value is assigned. Most engineering roles are evaluated based on output. Code written, features delivered, velocity maintained. The relationship is relatively clear. More output, more perceived value. But DevOps operates under a different logic. It sits closer to systems that cannot fail. Infrastructure, deployment pipelines, availability layers. These are not areas where failure is tolerated. They are areas where failure stops everything. And when everything stops, the cost is immediate. Revenue pauses, users leave, trust drops. This creates a different kind of visibility, because the impact is not abstract. It is operational, immediate, and measurable in real time. And that changes how companies assign value, not based on how much you produce, but based on how much risk you are responsible for. The closer your role is to critical failure points, the more expensive your mistakes become, and the more valuable your presence becomes. That is why DevOps salaries move faster, not because the work is inherently harder, but because the consequences are clearer and easier to quantify. But there is another layer most people miss. DevOps does not just sit near systems. It sits between systems. It connects development with production. It connects code with reality. And that position creates leverage because it controls how things move, how they deploy, how they scale, how they recover. This is not just execution. It is coordination. And coordination is harder to replace. But this comes with a structural trade-off. DevOps roles do not scale the same way as other engineering roles. You don't need 10 DevOps engineers for every product team. You need a few, sometimes very few, which means the number of available positions is limited. And that limitation changes the entire dynamic. Because now it's not just about being capable, it's about being selected. Companies don't just hire DevOps engineers, they filter aggressively. Because these roles sit close to systems that affect the entire organization. And mistakes don't stay local, they propagate. A backend bug might affect one feature. An infrastructure failure affects everything. That difference changes the risk profile. And that risk profile changes the hiring standard. That's why the tolerance is different. And that's why the bar is higher. Not just technically, but organizationally. You need trust. You need reliability. You need consistency under pressure. That's why entry is harder than it looks. Not because of skill alone, but because of exposure. You are not just writing code. You are maintaining systems that everything else depends on, and that changes the threshold. Even for engineers with strong technical ability, access is restricted. And this creates a hidden competition layer, not visible from the outside, because many engineers aim for these roles, but few are allowed in. And once inside, the structure does not relax. DevOps roles carry ongoing pressure, not occasional delivery pressure, but constant system responsibility. There is no real off state, because systems do not pause. They continue running. And when something breaks, it doesn't wait. It escalates. And it lands on the people closest to the system, which means responsibility is continuous, not scheduled. And that changes how the role feels over time, because the job is not just execution, it is ownership. And ownership accumulates. You don't just fix problems, you inherit them. You don't just deploy systems, you maintain their consequences. And that creates a long-term cost, because pressure compounds. Expectations increase, tolerance for failure drops, and visibility becomes constant. There is less room for error, and less time to recover from it. Which is why many engineers don't stay, not because they can't do the work, but because the cost of staying increases, fatigue increases, pressure accumulates, and alignment becomes harder to maintain. So when you look at DevOps salaries, you are not looking at a shortcut. You are looking at a position where risk is concentrated, failure is visible, and responsibility is continuous. And in that position, the system assigns higher value, not as a reward, but as a requirement, because failure is not an option. And that is what actually drives the pay. This is part of what I break down step by step in the $200,000 system.